world. Drop a comment and let me know what you think should happen in cases like these. See you in the next one.